Hello, welcome to the geographic profile of Latin America for Geographic Community College, Geography 111. Talk about Latin America, we should first discuss the area of population. What is Latin America? When I say Latin America, what do I mean? The book is defining Latin America as Mexico, down south to the bottom of the continent of South America, Argentina and Chile. And we're also going to clump the Caribbean islands into this. About 38 different countries spanning quite a breadth of latitude. Usually would subdivide Latin America into Middle America and South America. South America, of course, being the continent of South America, Middle America being the chunk between United States of America and the continent of South America. Population, over 500 million. Of course, like with all numbers in this class, it's grown since the creation of the slideshow. And as with most other parts of the world, majority urban. Map of the area we're talking about. This should be familiar to most of us because we have a lot of Americans in this class, so I'm sure you've seen this map before, right? Noteworthy things, of course, the Amazon River, we'll get to that. A few mountain ranges worth talking about, and a nice chain of islands up there, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, what have you. Also Love Table, of course, makes an appearance yet again, pointing out some of the more populous areas. Do have a few countries in this section that are very populated, those two being Mexico and Brazil, and quite a few countries, especially the Caribbean islands, very tiny populations, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, places like that. Overall, we tend to see, as with Africa, a lower HDI, Human Development Index rating. Not quite as bad as Africa in the 4s and 3s, but here we have 5s and 6s and a few 7s. And in general, these parts of the world aren't doing quite as well as, say, Europe, or when we get to it, America. Closing out that list. Again, nothing too exciting, nothing we haven't already seen. This map, of course, connects very easily to the United States. You can see the size differential here. It is noteworthy how large, when we get to it, Brazil is. Brazil, I think, is the 5th largest country. That's saying something. And as we notice, we're between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, right on the equator. What do we have when we're near the equator? Lots of your tropic biomes and climates, which is exactly what we run into here. Population distributions, majority urban, but not too much. Centralized around a few major cities, but there's a big center portion of South America that is very low population count. That's because that's the Amazon rainforest. I'm sure you're already aware of that, however. Cartogram, as usual, debatable how informative this is. But again, Mexico and Brazil, your big factors, your big populations here. But some of the other countries, Colombia, Argentina, Venezuela, arguably Guatemala and Cuba, roaching up there, still have noteworthy population sizes. So let's talk some physical geography and human adaptations, as we tend to do. Latin America is an extraordinary climate and biotic diversity. You do get a swath of climates and biomes in this area, not just the tropical rainforest that you picture when you picture South America, right? We do actually have some desert environments up in Mexico, and then steppes down in Argentina, Chile, what have you, in Patagonia region, and a bit of a Mediterranean climate hidden away. Climate map, right? We've talked about this already. These are things you're probably well acquainted with beforehand. Your tropics are around the equator, and your tropics are around your Amazon rainforest. You get some desert in Mexico, and you get some desert down in the bottom of Argentina in the Patagonia region. We'll talk about that. And that gray running through that undifferentiated highland is your Andes Mountains. Not too Nothing too new and exciting here. A little bit of Mediterranean climate there. Okay, I don't know much about that particular swath of Chile, it looks like. Biomes, of course, matches up with climates on almost a 1-to-1 scale. Big tropical rainforest in the center of South America. That's because of the tropical rainforest there, right? Desert biomes where you have desert climates, etc., etc., etc. Again, these go together. This is a what 7th example of these two maps lining up almost perfectly because your biome tells you your climate. Elevation levels, since you have the Andes Mountains on one end and the rainforest on the other end of South America, you get quite a differentiation in climate. Latin America is called Latin America, of course, because they're Latin, Spanish in origin. So you have the altitudinal zonation following Spanish language. Caliente, Helida, I don't know French, I don't know Spanish, sorry. But you have this wide variety in elevation, giving you, of course, a wide variety in your daily temperatures. You can get up in the Andes Mountains, very high above tree level, very cold weather, and then it don't take long to fall down into the Amazon rainforest. Both of these in Brazil in the same, you can really fall down the mountain and land in the rainforest or get your sugar canes, your tropical fruits, etc., etc. Kind of a cool juxtaposition in terms of topography. Of course, the land use map, again, follows the biome and climate maps and is dominated by what's available. If you have some desert, you can't really do a lot with desert, so you have your grazing and your nomadic farming going on. Likewise, the rainforest is so massive, you can't actually use rainforest land for some sort of production, so that's why we have shifting cultivation, i.e. nothing's really sticking. It is worth discussing that grazing stock rearing appears to be pushing itself into the Amazon rainforest, right from the south. We can see, if we go back a bit, the rainforest biome does not have the same little bubble in the south that the land use map has. This is the cutting down of the rainforest in an image here. And of course, that's something we'll discuss more, but I'm sure you're well aware of it. Other noteworthy things, plantation style, your cash crops, popular here. Some forestry and dairy farming, that kind of goes with your grazing stock rearing, I would argue. Yeah, overall, again, these maps are never too surprising, but always informative. Here's an example of that plantation, that cash crop we've been talking about. Coffee beans. Coffee, of course, is grown in Latin America, right? Colombian coffee is a standard name that we give to it. And in case you didn't know, coffee grows on trees as green little beans that they then roast up to give you and grind to give you the coffee you want. And it is noteworthy here, there's pictures of a child picking the coffee beans. Something to keep in mind. More examples of the farming. This area is known for the terrace farming and farming on hills. Ancient civilizations, of course, erected very impressive looking terrace farms so they could grow crops on this uneven terrain. These farms are not the kind of farms you find in Kansas and Nebraska, right? They follow the terrain because they have to. You're not going to blow up the side of a mountain. Yep, pictures from scrubland. Nope, wrong way. Sorry about that. Natural hazards in Latin America. Of course, on the west side of Latin America, you run into the Pacific Ocean and the ring of fire that encompasses the Pacific Ocean. That ring of fire brings along with it earthquakes and volcanoes. In fact, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, a 9.5 on the magnitude scale, was off the coast of southern Chile in the 1960s. A 9.5 is stupid powerful. It's not even, you can't comprehend that amount of energy. It's just nuts. Since you are butting up to two oceans, you also, of course, get hurricanes and typhoons for the Atlantic and the Pacific. And El Nino the climate pattern that we sometimes deal with up here in the United States actually originates down in South America. The winds off the Pacific coast of Peru switch directions, bringing with it an upwelling of water temperatures, changing climate around for the area. Sometimes you get hot, sometimes you get cold. Sometimes it moves up here and we have weird weather up in our part of the world. Natural hazards of Latin America, stuff they have to deal with. Visual demonstration of El Nino and what's actually going on. Again, this is a wind and therefore water current event, if you will, that moves warm or cold weather to and fro with South America having to deal with it. You can get normal conditions as shown here on the left with not a whole lot of rain and what have you, and warm water pushing away from South America towards Australia. Or you can get El Nino conditions shown here on the right with lots of rainfall, lots of warm weather being pushed to South America as opposed to away from it. The thermal climb missing South America as opposed to landing on it, giving you warmer waters, giving you more rain, El Nino conditions. And again, we have seen these, we do see the effects of this as shown in the top picture up there, even up by unusually warm periods, droughts, what have you, a change in the weather of the year. So let's move on from the physical aspect. Let's go to the cultural and historical aspect. We started with Oceania, and that was a fair amount of depressing things when it came to the culture and history of the area. Moved to Africa, which was worse. And then we get to Latin America, which is also not necessarily the funnest story to read. Unfortunate this region came to be known as Latin America because the Latin people are European, right? The first Europeans arrived in 1492. It's when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? But at that time, there were hundreds of millions of Native Americans already living in this section of Earth. They're called Latin Americans, but Latin's only 500 years old, right? You have cultural hearths in the Andes Mountains in southern Mexico dating back far, far older than Columbus. Look at this. Look at all these different names of Native American groups and civilizations and the different ways to describe them. It's massive, right? And a fair amount of these people still live in these same similar locations. Some of these empires, we argue, are high civilized, meaning they built monuments that we can find and explore nowadays, such as the Aztecs and Mayas up in Mexico region, or the Incas down in Peru. Some of them are your tropical forest farm villages, your hidden tribes, if you will. As I said, some of these tribes still live, for example, deep in the rainforest to this day. And you can, we have 4 or 5 pictures of them. And actually, as of 2020, this is incredibly pertinent because of COVID-19 traveling around, and how is a, tribe that lives in the middle of the Amazon going to deal if someone gets sick in that sort of way. But yeah, all these people existed before Columbus, but we call this area Latin America. As I said before, a few of the examples here. Nazca, of course, famous for the Nazca lines. Aztecs, Mayans, Incas, you know already. But there was a huge variety in this area. I got a question here. Were the Native Americans affected by Western diseases passed on by colonists overseas? If so, any idea of how bad it was and how badly it affected the region? Yes. You would find most people would say that the Native Americans of the region were killed more so by the diseases brought over by the Europeans than by the Europeans themselves.
Really?
Yes, that is arguably one of the reasons why it fell as effectively as it did, because Columbus would arrive, he would meet with the people, wouldn't really get into much fight, but they'd essentially unknowingly cough on them, and then the disease would spread all throughout Central America by the time they came back, started killing them off in mass. That's not something that we can say verify to a certain extent, because the Native American groups didn't keep these records as well that we could find, but the math works itself out.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, the old disease blanket from the Native Americans in the United States, that same effect happened here as well. Of course, very famous architecture from the region. You all know these step pyramids that are very common throughout, big tourist destinations. I'm not going to try saying that word. Machu Picchu. Everyone wants to get to Machu Picchu at some time. A lot of these also, it's interesting because we don't quite know 100% what these purposes were. Originally, Machu Picchu was thought to be some sort of temple. I believe nowadays, the thought is that it's more of just like a little city up here, maybe like a rich people's like vacation house. You don't really know because they didn't keep records in the same way, let's say, the Egyptians or the Chinese did. So it's harder to ascertain this information. Plus, look at that landscape. It's really hard to walk through these mountains and find this stuff. Machu Picchu was hidden for quite a while. Languages play a very important part, of course. Native indigenous languages are still spoken, but we've lost quite a lot of them. That is a lot of people with individual languages that have simply been lost to time, or only spoken in a classroom setting at a university, not spoken by people anymore. And as such, we call this Latin America, right? So Spanish is the prevalent language because the Spanish were the big colonizers of this area. Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, outlier there. And then you do get French, Dutch, and English as well. But Latin America, Spanish-speaking America, the two go together. Again, with the notable exception of Portuguese. And then English, French, and Dutch up there in the top of Brazil. I think that's more of a government description of the languages than the people, but I've never been to this part of the world. I haven't been to those countries. I couldn't tell you 100% exactly what they're speaking in the day-to-day street. All right, let's talk Christopher Columbus. He is a very, very hot button issue at the time of the recording of this presentation. He arrived in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You all know the song. And Christopher Columbus arriving sparked profound changes in what would eventually become Latin America. Death, as said before, deliberate and unintended. They spread disease, but they also shot and enslaved lots of people. They developed cities and ports, started producing farming, started mining the resources of the land, introduced many different plants and animal species, noteworthy including horses, cattle, sheep, donkey, wheat, sugarcane, coffee, and beans. Those were all European introduced plants and animals. Horses are not native to the Americas. Coffee and bananas are not native to the Americas. So when you think of bananas, you think of a Chiquita banana and a Latin woman with a big fruit basket on her head. Bananas were brought here by the Europeans. It's not a native crop. Of course, slavery was a very large component in this process. The capturing of gold and silver, the El Dorado city of gold conquesting that was going on, and cannot be understated, the introduction of Catholicism. This part of the world is very Catholic. I don't think I need to explain to you, Roman Catholicism did not originate in this part of the world, right? If you ever get a chance to have street corn, you really need to do it. You haven't had proper corn until you've had street corn, preferably with a bunch of sauce and cheese on it. It is ridiculously good. Yeah, various pictures. Again, look at this image. Those buildings look European, don't they? That cathedral, that building on the right there, they look European because they were built by the Europeans, not built by the native people. The native peoples had their own cities, right? Had their own cities, had their own monuments, But when the Europeans came over, they essentially took all this land by force and built what they wanted to build on it. This is a tale as old as time, right? Here's a couple. The image says Mayan people. The bloodline is still alive, but it is so similar to the Native Americans, the United States, a difficult life to live. The majority of Latin Americans you would technically consider mixed heritage. The Latin Americans that were here when the Europeans arrived died off, and of course the Europeans got with them, if you will, and as a result, you don't have clean, quote unquote, bloodlines in this part of the world. As said there at the bottom, there, Argentina, Uruguay, and Costa Rica have significant white European ethnic groups, but beyond that, most everything is quote unquote mixed. You get your Europeans, your blacks, which again came from Africa, and your mulattoes and mezzitos. I'm going to assume that's how that was pronounced. So the people of Latin America very much have a difference of look throughout the country. Latin America is not a black. No region of the world has a people that look a certain way. That is a complete lie. Even within countries, you have very distinctive features among people. Latin America is a unique blend because the colonization was so strong here and the interbreeding, if you will. I feel like there's a better word than interbreeding, but something I can think of off the top of my head, was so strong here that you do get the American, the Spanish mixed with the locals, mixed with the natives down below to give you these unique blends. And then people such as Mayans up here that have tried to keep their within their own subculture is very much the minority. Economic geography, going from upsetting to upsetting. You generally consider this part of the world to be lesser developed, an LDC. People do not tend to enjoy a high standard of living, and a lot of people have poverty. Very much a haves and a have-nots scenario. Your metropolitans and your shanty towns, favelas and barrios. I really should stop trying to pronounce Spanish words. I do not know them. But again, those are even Spanish words that they call them, right? You do have a conversation very similar to Africa, wherein you have a large swath of natural resources, but the people that own the mines that make the money from the plantations tend not to be the people that live and work at the plantation. Your employee-owned company isn't really a thing in this part of the world, right? Heavy borrowing from international bank communities, again, similar to Africa. We talked about African nations being in debt and then having to accrue more debt to try to build the infrastructure in order to succeed. That's very much a thing that happens in this part of the world as well as others. So this picture of Peru, people living in, way too close of communities, very poor, undeveloped running water, hopefully power lines if you're lucky, sort of a situation. And then not pictured here is the few fortunate people in their gated communities with their security guards and their bulletproof cars. And your middle ground, you people that have an acre or two of land and their own washing machine and 2 cars, like in America, isn't really a big thing. Many countries, more than half of all export revenue is still derived from farm produce. Again, think your bananas, your coffee beans, what have you. You have an over-reliance on a narrow range of exports that makes these countries economically vulnerable to changes in market conditions. Highlighting here, banana republics. If you don't know what a banana republic is, you need to take half a day, find a good resource and look into that, because the Banana Republic is a ridiculous, tragic, almost seems like it should be out of a fictional story conversation. In super short, I'll use the example, I believe the company that we now call Chiquita Banana When it started as an export, I believe, in Panama, exporting bananas to America. And there was a white guy, I think, like a European and American, went down there and they started selling bananas, and bananas started taking off, and the government didn't like that this white guy essentially was taking all the land of Panama and making money himself by himself. The government thought that this is our land, we should be able to make some of this money too. And so the guy that ran the company that eventually became Chiquita Bananas basically asked the United States government, could you do something about this? And the United States government went in there and literally pushed forth guerrilla fighters to overthrow the government and replace the government that was fighting for the people with a government that would let this guy continue to quote unquote steal all the bananas and pay his workers slave labor so that he could keep getting rich, so bananas could still be cheap in America. Because Americans, I think this is like in the 20s, Americans loved bananas and they didn't want to pay top dollar for them. So the United States government overthrew the people, I believe this was Panama, but I could be mistaken, overthrew the government that was fighting for better wages for their native people because Americans don't want to pay a lot for their bananas. And that's where the term banana republic comes from. That was super oversimplified. I suggest if that's of interest to you, you look into it yourself. That being said, right, it's a conversation to be had. Cool. Let's talk about types of farms. As said before, this particular part of the world is prioritized mostly in farming. Again, similar to Africa, although Africa does have mineral resource and oil, which we'll get to here. You have essentially two types of farms going on. You have your haciendas, your plantations, your strong commercial-oriented farms, and then your smaller subsistence farms that grow food people eat, that are very small, don't have a lot of money, and don't do very well. This is because the haciendas, the plantations in the region, take up all the best land because they can get all the money. And then, of course, the guy that owns the plantation is only the one that's making the money here. So your small subsistence farms, the farms that grow food people in the area eat, need to have some sort of sharecropping program going on there where they don't actually own their own land. And they have to pay someone to farm their land to then barely make any money. Africa, again, is in a very similar situation. A lot of its produce. Here we have a plantation in the Yucatan. And the question is, how profitable is this farm? If it gets to be profitable enough, I guarantee you locals don't own it. Another picture of corn. Okay, gotta work on this. Minerals and mining is similar to Africa. There's a lot of connections here. Very big, and Oceania, very big part of the conversation. Chile is the largest copper producer in the world. That is mainly because Chile doesn't have necessarily the most copper in the world, but they care the least about how much they damage the environment to get it, which allows them to produce more copper than anyplace else, and that's the main part of their economy. Again, if you live on the GCC campuses, you live near the copper country. We have lots of copper up here, but we don't tend to mine it because we don't want to destroy the environment. Chile is not quite as good about that. Venezuela and Brazil, very big for iron ore and oil. OPEC is the oil producing countries conglomerate, mostly all Middle Eastern countries working there. Venezuela is one of them because Venezuela has very, very large amounts of offshore oil. And again, as stated before, you do find a lot of the money made from these companies tend to not benefit the local people. Venezuelan oil would be an example where that is not the case, because Venezuela is the one that's actually pulling out their oil, so that money can go back into the economy. Same thing with Chile. The Chilean copper producers are government ran, so the money stays within Chile. Is the argument. How much that actually falls through is a bit questionable. Comment here if it fits in. Would you say a few things about drug cartels? Not sure what's going on with that right now. I believe we do talk about the drug trade in this conversation, but I'll make sure to throw that in at the end if somehow it's missed. Um, you probably have all heard of NAFTA at some point in your lives, North American Free Trade Agreement. That is been rescinded as of, I think, like last week and replaced by the USMCA, in a way, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. And these are essentially, but those are the ones that have to do with the United States. As you can see from this list, this Latin America, Central and South America, have lots of economic union and free trade agreement propositions that allow the countries to work with each other in order to hopefully better their economies. There is a push similar to European Union or the African Union for some sort of Latin American Union where the countries can essentially work and trade as one, but it's not quite as strong as the European and African unions in process, sadly. Yeah, free trade agreements, of course, are a thing in this particular section of the world. Look at all these economic associations going on here. Again, replace NAFTA with USMCA. Not a big difference between the two, however. Don't yell at me about that statement. Yeah, each of these different colors represents a different organization of countries working together to hopefully get a bit more power economically. You're going to notice that there's 5 or 6 different groups. There is not, in fact, one big group. That is part of an issue. I think Mercosur, I'm mispronouncing that. Where are we here? Southern Cone Common Market. Nah, I don't know how that's pronounced. I think that one's one that's a push for a European Union, African Union styled large economic association that works better for the cause. Because the whole point of the European Union, as stated before, is instead of 8 different countries and 8 different economies all vying for something, they can all act as one large economy, right? That gives them more say, more power. That hasn't happened in Latin America. That is, I think, the way things tend to trend, and that hopefully, cross your fingers, will eventually become of Latin America, and Latin America can assert itself more on the global stage. And that being said, with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and COVID-19, who knows what's going to happen in the future, right? But that's at least on paper and pencil what the idea is. You may have heard of remittance before. Remittance is something you need to talk about when you talk about Latin America. Essentially, the idea of a remittance is earned savings are sent home by people working abroad to their family. If you make some money, you send a certain percentage of that home because where you're working, you can have a higher wage and your dollar will go further back home than what if you got a job back home. A lot of people that come from Latin America to the United States to work send a fair amount of the money back home because, $100 in America, well, that's, I can spend that on dinner with my girlfriend if we get a bottle of wine, right? $100 back home when your house looks like this, that could maybe be a week's wage or something like that. So remittance is a very large driving force in these lesser developed countries. And remittances are a thing throughout the world. Anytime you have a country that is financially in trouble, juxtaposed very close to a country that is financially secure, such as the Middle East with Europe, for example, you have this remittance program going on. We just talk about it in this section, particularly because of the United States-Mexico conversation. Mexico, as of 2014, I think, $24 billion of the Mexican economy comes from laborers in the United States. That, I believe, was one of the arguments President Trump made for the border wall was we can stop these remittances from going back. That's going to hurt your economy. But yeah, that's a thing. But Canada, I think, also has remittance things going on there. You do get certain multi-Latina companies. Again, Latina, it's Latin, so it shouldn't really be called Latin, right? Multi-Latina companies with some experienced workers returning to their homes after establishing companies and investments in the United States. You have companies like Chevy, Ford, what have you, building factories in these lower income places because they can pay people less. And this is not something exclusive to Latin America. This is something throughout the world. But as Americans, I'm assuming a lot of you that watch this movie and are in the class are Americans. This is something that is very well familiar with. The quote South Park, they took our jobs conversation, right? That's a slide on the subject. Beyond crops, beyond mineral resources, beyond remittance, you have tourism. You get on a cruise ship, you are probably going to the Caribbeans, Belize, Cuba, Panama, something like that, right? Tourism is a major asset for a lot of these countries. A lot of people visit the Amazon rainforest. A lot of people go to Patagonia, etc., etc. However, tourism revenue tends to reflect a distance decay relationship. Because Mexico is so close, the highest tourism receipts flow to Mexico, and the nearest neighbor is the United States, so that's where it gets all its money. Patagonia has a lot less people going to visit it, even though it's well worth visiting, because you got to travel all the way down to Argentina. So to end tourism very much ebbs and flows with the economy. When the economy is doing good, tourism is very popular. When the economy is doing poor, such as now, tourism flounders. Big issue to have there. That is a list of all the ways the United States has messed with Latin America. And that's a big list, right? And that list has probably gotten bigger, and it's probably missing half the stuff it should. We have America has, as said before, been an integral part of Latin American development since, as said here, the early 1900s at the least. And it's never really been for the development of Latin America. It's always been to keep them down and to keep our bananas cheap. You can make the argument that there are benefits, again, mostly to America, for this geopolitical involvement, as says down below, promoting trade, guaranteeing secure access to oil, red flags, right? Flash that one, and fighting drug trafficking. Because I'm sure, again, you're aware because you live in America and you've seen the news before, drug trafficking is an issue in Latin America. There is a fantastic Gordon Ramsay episode where he goes to like Venezuela or something like that, and he actually meets with some people that make cocaine in the jungles. And the process to make cocaine is ridiculous. I highly suggest you look up that Gordon Ramsay South America cocaine video sometime and learn a little bit about it, because holy crap. That's the best I can say there. But of course you have, let's say, your Mexican drug cartels as well, El Chapo, what have you. Yeah, Eric, I actually talked about the Banana Republics a bit before you came in here. But you have your, again, drug trafficking with El Chapo, what have you. That was a big issue, of course, in Mexico in the 2000s, 2010s, when the drug cartels were more or less wreaking havoc. So, well, there is a lot of questionable things that America does with Latin America. You do have to worry about these things, such as access to oil, drug trafficking, what have you. It's not, as with majority of things, the conversation is never as simple as you want it to be. Right? All right. So that was lots of broad overviews of everything. Again, this class is introductory. If any of this stuff is of interest to you, shoot me an email, comment down below. I can find you some more information, dive a bit deeper if you want to. I do suggest it. Understanding drug trafficking, banana republics, Bay of Pigs, things of that nature will only make you more informed and allow you to make better decisions. So let's talk Panama Canal. Panama Canal was built at the beginning of the 1900s over a 10-year period, noteworthy, by American contractors to serve United States commercial and strategic interests. And it's in a different country. The canal zone was technically considered a U.S. territory up until 1999 when it was handed over to the Panama, meaning from 1920 so to 1999, about 80 years, anyone that used the Panama Canal paid America to use it. So Panama has only been able to reap the benefits of the Panama Canal for the past like 20 or so years. Interesting, right? What is the Panama Canal? Well, basically, it says, oh, instead of going all the way around the tip of South America, those 13,000 miles to get from one side of the United States to the other, I'm going to cut through the Panama Canal, and I'm going to more than half my trip allow me to get from New York, for example, to San Francisco way faster. Likewise, if you want to come from Oceania, Asia area over to Africa, Europe, there may be an argument made that depending on where you are, the Panama Canal may be a better choice. You may not, I mean, because you cross the Pacific Oceans a lot, but someplace like Korea or something like that, that's a conversation to be had. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of the Panama Canal. I don't need to go too in-depth into it, apart from the, again, hilarious nature of the fact that the United States decided we wanted this, so we took a chunk of land from the country of Panama and owned it. And as I said before, the Banana Republic association with it, because I believe the Panama Canal, the company is now Chiquita, was started by one of the contractors because he was feeding the workers, the native workers, bananas because they were cheap. And that's why he started selling them to America, because the contractor, the people that built Panama Canal got paid so little, their food was bananas. And that's not a joke use of bananas. It was physically bananas. You would eat bananas for lunch and dinner. So, all right, let's go to a few bullet points topics on this conversation, then we can be out of here. Mexico. Mexico's largest, most complex, and most influential country in Middle America. That's debatable. Brazil is up there as well, but Brazil, of course, is a more resurgent recently, like similar to China, where in the timing of the slideshow to modern day, Brazil and China have grown quite a bit. Spanish is spoken in Mexico. I'm sure you're aware of that. Mexico City is the world's second largest city by population. Mexico City is huge. Mexico City, you could argue, is the majority of Mexico. This is really only compared to like Mexico City might actually be the biggest city, but I think the only other city that comes close to it is Tokyo, I want to say. Yeah, huge, massive city. The majority of what goes on in Mexico happens in Mexico City. Most of the country's population is urbanized because they live in Mexico City. And when you talk Mexico City, you have to talk the United States. The two are very much interlinked, very large trade partners, very large import-export relationship. You do have, as said before, it's less of a conversation nowadays, but especially during the 90s and 2000s, companies, going to Mexico to build their factories because labor is cheaper. That conversation is more moved to Oceania now, like Singapore and stuff like that. But yeah, big trade conversation happening between Mexico and the United States. Oil, funny enough, is Mexico's most important export. A lot of oil resides in and around Mexico. The majority of that oil goes to the United States. Mexico is our second or third highest in source of oil after Canada and of course ourselves. So yeah, a lot of oil in the region. Something you don't really think about when you think about Mexico is the oil, but they got a fair amount. A bit more about the Panama Canal here, right? Connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. A lot of stuff was cut through at the time. In 1855, a railroad is established to help move stuff along. Um, that being said, the railway can only get you so far, right? A boat moves a lot of stuff a lot better than a rail system was. So in 1903, as said down here, the United States essentially struck a deal, quote unquote, with the government of Panama to build this large lock system to allow boats to travel the Atlantic Pacific Ocean rather expediently. And that has grown and boosted worldwide trade, very similar to the Suez Canal in the Middle East. And we talked about that, how going from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean saves a lot of time and money as opposed to going around the southern coast of Africa. Similar conversation. And again, that's a whole can of worms. It's worth getting to yourself if you want. Venezuela's been in the news very recently, right? They've had a very large economic collapse. But when this slideshow was made, prior to that, Venezuela was actually doing pretty well for itself because there's lots of oil in Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the largest oil producers in the world. It's a member of OPEC, and it's not in the Middle East, right? So much so that basically Venezuela ebbs and flows on oil prices. The Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, you may have heard of him, spearheaded a regional quest for liberation in Spain because we haven't talked about it too much, but a lot of South America and Latin America were colonies for quite a long time, similar to Africa and Oceania. However, different from Oceania and Africa, when colonization ended, Venezuela is a good example of this. When colonization ended in Central and South America, things didn't always go smoothly. For example, Hugo Chavez liberated this country from Spain, but then he rewrote the Constitution. He put some friends on the Supreme Court and controlled the media and jailed political forces, and essentially ruled the country as he wanted to because of Venezuela's massive oil wealth. He could kind of do what he wanted. And look at Venezuela nowadays. You could argue the economy was not built very broadly. So you have a collapse in the oil market. Now all of a sudden Venezuela's money is worthless and people are starving to death. Well, the government probably isn't starving to death, other people are. So Venezuela is a good key point for an interesting conversation as to the repercussions of a country that was essentially controlled by someone else for many years, suddenly gain independence. How do we deal with this, right? In the modern world, wherein you have the entire global economy bearing down on you. Colombia, as opposed to Venezuela, is doing a lot better recently. And even nowadays, Colombia is still vastly improving. I'm going to say similar to the way you can look at Ethiopia, for example, or I think, I'll just use Ethiopia as an example, in Africa. Abundant natural resources, much less infighting than what has been going on in the past for Colombia. Large hydropower capacity, coal and oil, natural gas, iron and nickel reserves throughout. When you think of Colombia, you either think of the coffee or cocaine, probably. But the country is slowly moving away from drug cartels as their main resource. And with the legalization of marijuana throughout the world, Colombia is only benefiting. There's a lot of natural strains of marijuana that are found only in Colombia that people, again, you can go watch documentaries and people walking around Colombia finding new strains of weed and becoming millionaires from it. Interesting turn of events, right? A lot of these countries are ridiculously interesting and unique in their stories. Brazil is a can of worms in and of itself. This slideshow does not know about Jair Bolsonaro, does not know about COVID-19, does not know about whatever the heck is going on in this particular part of the world. It is the largest Latin American country in terms of area population and in terms of clout. Brazil is, I think, the fourth or fifth largest country in the world. Uh, Someplace around Russia in size, I can't quite remember. For population, obviously not for square mileage. And since Brazil is such a potent economy, it gets a lot of sway that you wouldn't expect its friends you wouldn't expect in Latin America to have. For example, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Very large, fast-growing cities such as Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Large growth from less developed to more developed, giving them diversification in manufacturing and agriculture export. That all being said, two things you need to talk about with Brazil are the unequal distribution of its wealth, a very much have and have not conversation, and its treatment of its natural resource, the Amazon. And again, this is sidestepping Jair Bolsonaro and his very strong-armed government and hatred of masks, but that's you know about that as of the recording of this video, so I don't need to get into that. The Amazon rainforest and the Amazon basin is something we've all seen, something we're all very familiar with. It's a massive jungle. It is a massive river, and it runs straight through arguably the strongest, most important country in the region. But as we talked about before with Africa and Oceania, and a little bit in Asia, you can't really do a lot with a rainforest in and of itself. Sure, it's good for tourism, but you can't farm rainforests. You can't take in herd animals, and you can't you can't hunt in the rainforest effectively. So what Brazil's been doing, which has been very, let's say, not frowned upon by the world, is, as I always say in this picture here, eventually, there we go, been pushing into the Amazon rainforest and clear cutting it and changing the tropical rainforest biome, as you see here with the dark green. Again, look at that dark green in top of Brazil, tropical rainforest, and turning it from rainforest into, as seen there, grazing and stock rearing. Right in that center, that bubble there was rainforest that they clear cut out of the way so they can have cows eat the grass. And as of, I want to say, a year ago, maybe more, we had the issue where the Amazon rainforest had caught fire, and it's kind of hard to put out because that's a lot of trees, right? Look at the existing rainforest, and then look at, again, the deforestation areas all throughout it. That has only grown extensively since the making of this slideshow. The world's largest rainforest is being burnt down so you can have cheap Big Macs. And that's, sure, technically it's more complicated than that, but not a whole lot more complicated, sadly. But what are you going to do with this rainforest? You can't just, if you just leave it there, no one's making any money. So it's quite a big give and take, right? You just going to, everyone wants trees. You need lumber. You could chop down the trees, put something there that's more beneficial to the local economy, arguably. What do you do? It's a whole conversation well beyond the scope of this class, but it's a conversation worth having, and it's a conversation worth knowing about. So that concludes the conversation on Latin America, South and Central America, I should say. Very complicated issue, very relevant to today, something you should know about, especially if you live in America because you're right next to it, right? And yeah, shoot, comment down below if you're watching this as a YouTube video. Shoot me any questions you want. I'll pause the recording, and then we can go into a little conversation with the students here. And thanks for watching.